When I think about the current state of Canadian television, the only thing I can say is it's really disappointing would be gentle, appalling would probably be my position. The role of dissent, the idea that the journalists are supposed to sit in a different position to actually assist us to engage and understand not just what the government in power is doing, but what everybody is doing. What are the opposition parties saying? Is that a legitimate position? Is that the only critique that could be made, or is that opportunistic? All of those pieces, it's almost as if they don't have faith in us as the viewing public, that if they gave us something somewhat more complex, we're not going to want it. I'll give you an example of something that I found tremendously frustrating and a demonstration of the contradiction in terms of coverage of an issue. When you look at the issue of military spending and where our military is, you can see that with the issue of Afghanistan, we don't have a lot of coverage. We don't have a lot of information. We don't even know what really clear direction Canada wants to go in Afghanistan. So I'm not actually saying I disagree. I'm saying I'm not adequately informed. The interesting thing is that the media, particularly the television media, has had no difficulty talking about military spending, military policy, and worse yet, from my perspective, to give me unlimited access to the positions of the American ambassador to Canada, Cellucci, when he had concerns about whether or not we should enter Iraq, whether or not we were spending adequately on our military spending to work in harmony with the Americans, whether or not we should actually engage in other forms of collaboration on defense systems. I find that really disturbing. Disturbing on the one hand, because quite honestly, I don't want to go in the direction of the United States of America, and I would like to be fully informed of the consequences. And I don't want to hear bully on the block statements and to see the face of American expert after American expert suggesting that those in Canada who disagree are completely uninformed. But it becomes even more difficult when we are engaged in certain military endeavors. I don't even have a grip on what we're doing. I don't have the capacity to tease out every piece of information, to review everything. I have to depend and trust the assistance of the media to bring some of those interesting people, the real life experience to me, because I can't seek it out on each and every issue. That's what I think the television media can do. And part of that means that the television media has to stop simply choosing the same experts all the time. It's about moving to engaging in a broader body politic. There are people who are activists. There are people who are actually academics, public intellectuals. There are a range of people who actually think about these things. But what the media does, particularly the television media does, it can reduce people's sense of how complicated a conversation is or whether there even are meaningful opposition. I do believe that the media is suffering from the same problem that we have at a broader level in society, that there's increasing concentrations of capital. And the concentration of capital actually prevents people from being creative, makes people risk averse, leads to a kind of homogenization of what ideas are in the public domain. And we now have whole sections of the public, depending on what their interests are, and I would say particularly conservative section of the public saying, well, look, you know, if this doesn't meet our moral values, and we're seeing that tremendously in the States, if this doesn't meet our moral values, we're going to pull out. And so you're now having television media being self-censoring even before they take the risk. So we don't get a chance as a public to even experience certain things, I believe, because they're already trying to figure out what are going to be the consequences. And the consequences they're thinking about aren't consequences to truth, to democracy. They're thinking about the consequences to what's going to happen to our bottom line. How do we give our return to our investors? The Martha Stewart incident. I found it interesting because if you compare the coverage of Martha Stewart as the head of a company to the coverage of the heads of WorldCom and Enron, the sheer visibility that we had of Martha Stewart, and there might be a whole bunch of reasons for that, it was incredible. I mean, people would be hard-pressed to think, who did any of those people who ran WorldCom and Enron look like? The tsunami. The tsunami story came up at Christmas, which was a low news time. Had a tremendous amount of coverage. We had a huge outpouring of aid, and I think it was appropriately so. That being said, more people died in other natural disasters. We didn't have that kind of outpouring in response. Neither did we have that kind of media scrutiny and response. So the television media was obviously a clear party in getting the response in terms of aid. But if you go to the whole continent of Africa, more people die in a month. People are dying of AIDS in far larger numbers than the people who died in the tsunami. Africa, it's a huge country, but it's not just a huge country. It's supposed to be the birthplace of humanity. Africa has more natural resources than any place else on the planet. If you look at a country like South Africa and its incredible capacity for re-envisioning what justice is, it also has intellectual resources that we have lost. And yet, to get an engagement on equality issues for Africa, and when I say equality, I'm not talking about the constant, whenever there is a story, which is few and far between, Africa has corrupt governments, Africa has starving children, Africa doesn't know how to govern itself. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about having coverage of the fact that maybe the reason they have some of those governments is we've propped them up, repeatedly propped them up, eviscerated their democracies, and then thrown our hands up, or at least our governments have in the West, and said, oh my goodness, you don't seem to know how to govern yourselves. Independent World Television speaks to the concerns that many of us have. The television needs to be accountable, it needs to be transparent, it needs to inform, it needs to engage, and it needs to speak about the stories that not everybody is speaking to. That some of those stories may actually be the big story, that the big story isn't necessarily what you get peppered with and bombarded every day. And I think Independent World Television is about a collective endeavor, which is vastly different from current television. A global endeavor of activists and persons engaged, not just with the media, but with thinking about justice issues, political issues, legal issues in a global context. Independent World Television from the onset has as its premise the need to be apart from those corporate interests, to be in a position to make the choices about the stories that should be run, to be in a position to speak to who needs to be spoken to be in a position to say expertise is based on lived experience and content, not necessarily on how many times you've shown up in various sound bites. And I think those are the kinds of commitments that Independent World Television has. And that is why Independent World Television is using two sources I think that are critical. First of all, avoiding the corporate sources and the government sources. But the second is actually linking itself directly to a framework that will have individuals who will be served by the television saying, we can demonstrate our commitment because we're part of this. It's public, it's for us, we're going to contribute to it. And I think that there is actually a hunger on the part of the public to actually feel that there is a reciprocity between their engagement and what they receive back. And I think Independent World Television recognizes that and is really going to go ahead and develop something that I think it's going to be fabulous.